Hello and welcome to Ali's House Unlocked. This podcast is a little glimpse into my world as a childminder, sharing a little bit of knowledge about early childhood development and how that informs my practice as an early years educator, and how families can utilise similar approaches in the home to support their child's development. So if you're a parent, a practitioner, or just somebody who's interested in the world of early years, then you're in exactly the right place. Today's episode is all about my childminding environment. So not my brand of sofa or my colour of wallpaper, but the environment as the third educator. Because the spaces that our children spend their daily lives in can support or inhibit their development, often without us even realising. Now, I know this topic might sound a little dry because we're talking about rooms and layouts and resources, but bear with me on this one because the science is really interesting. Why do some spaces feel calm whilst other spaces feel really overwhelming? And I think as a society, it feels like we're drawn to certain kinds of aesthetics, and that's really noticeable across the early years industry in recent years. But why? And I'm really interested in what the science has to say about this. Does the environment have an impact on early childhood development? Does the room itself, the resources, the way space is organised, does it really influence how our children learn and grow? And according to the research, it absolutely does. In particular, I'm going to quote a body of work by Professor Sam Woss, who is an early years psychologist and neuroscientist. If you watched The Secret Life of 4-Year-Olds some time ago on Channel 4, then you'll know him from that. And his research is based on the latest cutting edge technology that allows us to look into children's brains like never before. And he says that the technology is showing us that the physical environment and the social environment both have a strong impact on babies and young children's development, specifically impacting the development of attention, learning, stress regulation, and emotional development. And every time I come back to the latest research on early childhood neuroscience, the more it affirms to me that as a society, we really need to shift the conversation about education. The science is telling us that we need to think of education less as teaching and curriculum content and more as brain building and the optimum conditions for brain building, especially in the early years. So the science is showing us that the physical environment is one of those conditions that is having a somewhat secret impact on early development. And when I talk about the physical environment, what I'm talking about are factors such as environmental noise and auditory input. So how many voices there are in a space. Is there background music? Is there an echo, etc.? Elements such as crowding, how many bodies are there in a space and therefore the unpredictable movement of bodies. Visual clutter, like posters, colourful displays on the wall, how many reams of toys. And sensory stimulation, for example, like artificial lighting and more. Let's put it this way. Anecdotally, any parent who has ever tried to have a play date and a conversation with another parent in a soft play knows inherently that environment matters. Even as an adult with a proficient, mostly, fully formed brain that can choose attention and filter out distraction, you're trying to have a conversation in a noisy soft play and it's so hard to concentrate. And then despite the noise, you hear the distant cry that cuts through somehow and you have to pause for a moment and you lose your attention again to try and work out if it's your child. And then it's always too hot or too cold, which is uncomfortable. And then there's the music channel on the big telly on the wall, which you can't help but keep glancing at. And then a child grabs your arm thinking you're their mummy. And then the food comes out and you've got to try and somehow wrangle your child out of this busy soft play to get them to actually sit down and eat, when actually all you're doing is calling up and talking to the soles of their feet while they walk across a rope bridge up above you. And it's absolute chaos. And you think, well, I don't know why we all put ourselves through this in the first place. Now imagine that conversation you were having was an English grammar lesson. I mean, how much did you learn? And that's with your proficient adult brain that can filter out distractions. But on a daily basis, we put our toddlers into rooms filled with other toddlers and we expect them to learn the English language from scratch, amongst many other things in 7 broad areas of learning. And now, actually, our babies' brains are really good at learning languages. They're super good, far better than an adult brain, which is a strength. But sometimes might our environment be presenting barriers that we could otherwise do without. And for some children, those barriers will be overcome regardless. Some children are dandelions. They will just grow anywhere. But for some children, those barriers will be like putting mountains in their path. So to have a fair and inclusive education system, every setting's environment really does matter. So now let's back up what makes anecdotal logical sense with what the science says. And I'm going to quote Professor Sam Boss again in super simplified and brief form. So thinking about our 0 to 2-year-olds here specifically, I'm going to term our 0 to 2-year-olds as babies. And babies' brains are messy. Our brains are made up of lots and lots of cells called neurons, and these neurons form connections with each other, forming pathways called synapses. Now, babies actually have way more connections in their brain than adults, making it a massively over-connected, over-wired, messy brain in those first 2 years of life. And then as we get older, the brain prunes itself down to what it actually needs. So knowing this about young children's brains, knowing that they are overly wired and messy, the implication of that is that children find it really hard to choose what to pay attention to and to filter out distraction and to regulate when they're experiencing a lot of sensory input. Their brains are absolutely frantic in taking it all in without the ability to control and regulate, so overwhelm can easily set in. And now to quickly quote a different body of work, some research that was conducted by Jeffrey Ellman. We can also conclusively say about children's brains that if we want them to learn something effectively, then we need to give them a simple form first and build up to a more complex form or a more complex model. What education people will know as scaffolding. And again, that sounds so logical and obvious, but it's important. It's important to this, and it's important that we know that it's scientifically proven. Let's think about this then in terms of the early years environment. So when we put babies into large settings with their messy brains, we're putting them into complex, rich environments where there's lots of noise, lots of people, lots to see, lots to listen to. But what the science is telling us is that we need a simple environment first to build up from. A simple environment being a place that allows for slowed down, one-to-one interactions, as well as predictability and repetition in the extreme. Stripped back environments with soft furnishings, soft lighting, and less auditory input, and fewer resources that are more open-ended and rich in nature, which we'll come on to. Also, having those fewer resources that are rich in nature set up in a way that allows for free exploration, free movement, and high quality, slowed down social interactions. These are the things that make the difference. Gone are the days of having the alphabet poster and the numbers poster and the languages poster lining the walls. I mean, so much visual noise and so much irrelevant distraction to what the child is actually interested in, and therefore the thing that is actually building their brain. So when I think about my child-minding environment then, I can see that I'm already at an advantage. My space is already small and intimate and comfortable because it's my home. And therefore, I don't try and turn my space into a typical nursery or a classroom because I understand the absolute positive impact that my home environment is having on children's development. This is exactly what children need. And if you're a parent or a family member who's watching this, then you can be rest assured that your home then is already an amazing space for supporting your child's development. You don't need to turn your home into a classroom. But even a home environment can become an overly complex space if we're not mindful about what we're filling that space with, both in terms of our physical stuff as well as our routines and the energy that we bring to that space as adults. So here are my top 3 considerations for stripping back your home or stripping back your early years environment to create that simple space that is more conducive to early development and better suited to messy brains. So, number 1, we need to consider if we are a communication-friendly environment. Now, if you want to know more about supporting your child's communication and language development, then you can go back to episode 2 of this podcast, where I share my top 10 tips for supporting your child's language development and creating high-quality interactions. But what does communication-friendly mean in terms of physical space here and environment? Well, first, I think it means reducing unnecessary distractions, which includes both auditory and visual where possible. So creating opportunities for conversation or storytelling or shared attention that's led by the child's interest. So let's give a scenario that your child is playing with the stacking blocks. And as an adult, you want to name the colours of the blocks and count the blocks and stack them in order because that feels like really good learning. But actually all your child wants to do is tip those blocks the other way around and fill them up with random things from around the playroom. And that's okay. That's their interest that we can follow, because if that's what they're interested in, then that's what is building their brain in that moment. And doing that in a communication-friendly environment means minimum background noise. So no TV in the background, no radio, phone bleeps off. In a space that's as decoratively neutral as possible and where everything is as slowed down as possible. So you're sat on the floor. You're facing your child so that they can make eye contact with you when they're ready to share something. And you're fully invested in the activity. And it's as simple as that. Add here the communication strategies that I share in episode 2, and you've got a really specialized space for brain building and for supporting your child's development without spending hundreds of pounds on equipment. Now, in my childminding space, I do utilize other tools such as Makaton, symbols, visual timetables to make sure that my space is inclusive to all developmental pathways. But if you're a parent or a carer or a family member listening to this, then the main thing is that all your young child needs is your face on their level, your presence of mind, and your consistently loving responses. It's as simple as that. And that's not to say we can maintain that all the time, especially if there are multiple children or you've got to get the lunch sorted, etc. But we can be mindful in making sure that we do some of this every day. We keep that time sacred by making it part of our consistent routine. And then not feeling like we have to sacrifice those slowed down, minimalistic parts of the day for those big, exciting, and often pricey adventures. Because actually, it's us, sat on the floor, present, in a quiet space that is actually giving the most valuable impact to our children's brain in that 0 to 2 year age bracket. Okay, my number 2 consideration is emotional regulation. So is my environment an emotionally regulating environment? So perhaps I should just touch for a minute on what emotional regulation is. So children are not born with the tools to emotionally and behaviorally regulate. Like so many things, regulation is a set of complex skills that it takes many, many years of practicing and honing to build. And to be honest, many adults still struggle with emotional regulation. So especially in that 0 to 2 year age bracket, those children are really just opening the toolbox, the regulation toolbox, and there really are no effective tools inside yet. And that means that children have to borrow regulation from the adults around them. That means that our calm feeds their calm, and vice versa. Our stress feeds their stress. So I want my childminding environment to feel calm, to be predictable, because when routines are consistent and predictable, we encounter less triggers for overwhelm. To be a welcoming space and to be a safe space. For those who have listened to my previous episodes and my cup language, the environment itself fills our safety cup and it provides a conducive space for filling our connection cup. That doesn't mean that my childminding space is silent or that the children aren't allowed to be noisy or excited. It just means that the environment itself is not constantly demanding their attention. So there aren't the flashing lights and all the noisy electronic noises, and there isn't the constant sensory overload. Instead, the environment is set up so there are spaces for free movement and free exploration, spaces to be solitary when we need to be, and spaces where we can be socially connected when we want to be. And the environment supports the children's nervous system rather than constantly stimulating it. And for those thinking about their home environment, often the living room is where we spend a lot of time, but those often can be, busy, quite complex and fast-paced places with everybody coming in and out, siblings coming in and out, and, everybody's stuff around in the corners, maybe a desk with wires and study books piled high. And it doesn't mean that we have to feel like that is wrong or bad, but it's just being mindful of looking at our child's day through that emotional lens. And then it might be that we mitigate those spaces or times by doing something different, like going outside, utilizing natural spaces nearby, because natural outdoor spaces are so great for balancing children's nervous systems and for our own well-being too. And finally, my number 3 consideration is toys versus open-ended resources. So talking about the environment supporting the nervous system as opposed to constantly stimulating it brings me nicely onto toys. And as a nation, we spend a huge amount of money on toys that are often marketed as supporting child development, making our children smarter, etc. But what is actually true? If we're talking about stripping back our environments to make them simpler, then what are the most valuable toys or resources that really make the impact? And what toys are actually just taking away from our communication-friendly and regulating environments? Baby Einstein toys are a classic example to me of toys being marketed as accelerating child development without the science to back it up. And actually, if you had the whole Baby Einstein range in your living room, I'd argue that it would actually be doing the opposite. So I was really happy when I was doing my research for this podcast that I'm not the only one that thinks this. There are actually lots of reputable voices talking on this topic, including a book that I found that's dedicated to this called Einstein Never Used Flashcards, which I've definitely added to my reading pile. But if you've never come across Baby Einstein toys or you've never gone into your local toy store, then what we're talking about here is, those big lumps of plastic with flashing lights and noisy buttons. And often you don't even have to press the button properly. You just have to kind of whack the thing and then it will recite the alphabet in 3 different languages. It's marketed as making your child smarter, but actually that's not how children learn. These toys encourage passive consumption. And actually those noisy buttons and those flashing lights just block out the thing that we now know children really need, that human interaction. Have several of those noisy toys in your environment and you've just taken your simple environment to a hugely complex environment and an absolute auditory nightmare. So that's what we don't need, but what actually do we need? And I found a nice, succinct way of saying this with Harvard Health Publishing, and they suggest that the toys that are most supportive of child development tend to fall into 3 categories: toys that encourage imagination, toys that encourage interaction, and toys that get children moving. And when I read that, I immediately thought, yes, that's why I use loose parts, because loose parts naturally tick all of those boxes. And what's a loose part? I hear you say. Well, a loose part is an interesting and intriguing object without a fixed purpose that doesn't tell the children to play. It invites them to explore. Loose parts can be made from all sorts of materials and can be used creatively, imaginatively, exploratively, and physically. So let me give you an example here. This is a toy ice cream. It will be a toy ice cream tomorrow, and it will be a toy ice cream the day after that. The possibilities are fairly limited versus this. So this tube can be an ice cream cone, or turn it around, and it could be a telescope. It could be a microphone, great for speech and language. It can become part of a marble run. It could be connected to other tubes to make a giant structure. It can be color sorted. You could make patterns with it. It could be rolled, balanced, stacked, posted, filled with objects used in imaginative play. That one simple resource, a tube, can support construction play, imaginative play, sensory play, mathematical thinking, problem solving, communication, and social interaction. The tube doesn't tell the child what to do. The child brings the ideas, and that's when the magic happens. And it costs way less than the big lump of noisy plastic that's sitting on the store shelves. Other examples of loose parts can include cardboard boxes, cardboard tubes, fabrics, materials, containers, lids, pots, pans, conkers, leaves, pine cones, sticks, feathers. Many of these resources are free. Many of them are recycled. Many of them would otherwise end up in landfill. So when we're stripping back our environments, let's ensure that we have some choice toys based on the child's interest, accompanied by some loose parts. So, a wooden play kitchen and the stacking cups, combined with some plastic jars of feathers and pine cones and conkers. And watch what happens. On a similar note, I just wanted to touch on authentic materials because that's something I use a lot in my childminding setting. So an example would be a plastic cup from, a plastic kitchen play set versus, a real cup and saucer and my wonderful and very popular real teapot. So this real cup and saucer and real teapot, these are objects from the real world. And, why does that matter? Well, because children learn through their senses and they gain a huge amount of sensory input from the objects that they handle. So when they're handling these authentic resources, they're noticing weight, temperature, texture, balance, fragility, material, the sound, the coolness of, the tin or the ceramic that feels different from the plastic. And metal feels different from wood. And children build an understanding of their world through these different experiences. When all our resources are made of lightweight plastic, then we miss out on that rich sensory input. Another example is dressing up. So instead of buying lots of expensive dress-up combinations from the toy shops, I much prefer to use real life clothing and accessories. So lots of bags, scarves, hats, shoes, jackets. They're sourced cheaply from charity shops, and not only are they more sustainable and affordable, but they're also more relevant. It's real items from the real world. And they're often far less heavily gendered than the commercial dress-up costumes. So, a child can put on a hat and can carry a handbag and wear a tie and put on a pair of shoes, experiment with identity, explore different roles, and nobody has to worry about whether the costume was marketed for boys or for girls. the resources simply become tools for imagination. Okay, so I know what's going through your mind. Grandma definitely isn't going to be happy getting little Joey an empty cardboard box and an old blouse for Christmas. But that's okay. You can still buy the lovely big play kitchen and value all the social interaction that comes out of that. But maybe once in a while you could swap the plastic food for the conkers that you go and collect from the woods, or leaves or buttons, being mindful of choking hazards depending on your child's age. And remembering that loose parts don't have to be small. So the good thing about Grandma's Play Kitchen is that it will come in a massive box, and that's one of the best kind of loose parts. Cut some holes in that box, little windows or flaps, add some balls, some soft toys or material, and again, see what happens. So if there's one thing I'd love you to take away from today's episode, it's this: that children don't need environments that are bigger, better, louder, or more expensive. They need environments that are developmentally appropriate, that help them to feel safe, connected, and able to focus on what matters. A simple space, a calm adult, time to connect, and empowered to play. So whether you're a parent at home or a grandparent or an early years practitioner, it's those things that will always have the greatest impact, rather than the latest educational toy or the most Instagram-worthy playroom. Because in the early years, development doesn't happen because we fill the room with stuff. Development happens through relationships and experiences and play, and the environment provides the barometer for how effectively those things can happen. Thank you for listening to Ali's House Unlocked, and if you've enjoyed today's episode or found it helpful or informative, please do share it with other parents or practitioners, anyone interested in child development, and I'll hope to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.